My name is Vanessa Ross. I'm a 27-year-old woman. I live in a small town in Colorado, in the foothills of the Rockies. By day, I'm a freelance graphic designer, working from the office of my two-bedroom house. I've lived here in Colorado for most of my life. I grew up about 15 miles from where I am now. I guess I never felt the pull to leave. There's something comforting about these mountains. I live alone, but I'm not lonely. My family is nearby. My parents and my younger brother Matt. And we're close. It's not unusual for me to spend my evenings reading or watching a show, and sometimes I'll head out for a short hike before the sun sets. I don't have a big, extravagant life. I like that. I'm fairly boring, and I like that too. But I have a story for you that is anything but boring. It was on one of those hikes that I saw the glitch. It was September, crisp but not cold outside. The trees were just turning gold, and the ground was littered with those coin-shaped leaves. I decided to take a quick hike along the trail. It was a trail that I knew well. It was about 5 miles out of town, and it doesn't get a lot of traffic, especially on weekdays. This was a Tuesday. It was quiet and serene. It's the kind of place where you can hear your own thoughts. Or maybe, as I learned, the kind of place where you might start questioning your own thoughts. I parked my car at the trailhead that day. I'd had plenty of time for a short loop before the sunset. The trail is a little over 2 miles long, winding through pine forest before opening up to a ridge with this stunning view of the valley below. In the middle of the trail, the forest gets dense, but it's no more than for a half a mile or so. Everything felt normal at first. I walked that familiar path, crunching the leaves, appreciating the area and admiring the squirrels and the chirping of birds settling in for the evening. But as I reached the ridge, the first strange thing happened. I was standing there, taking in the view. The valley was spread out below, and the distant peaks were glowing in the amber light. That's when I noticed something odd in the sky. At first, I thought it was a plane. There was a small shiny object moving steadily across the horizon, but it wasn't blinking like a plane does. I squinted, trying to make sense of what it was that I was seeing. It wasn't until this thing abruptly stopped in mid-flight that I was taken aback. Objects in the sky don't just stop flying. And it just hovered there, completely still for maybe 10 seconds. And then it moved again. But this time it darted sharply to the left, then right, in a zigzag motion that no aircraft that I knew of could replicate. I reached for my phone to record it, but as soon as I pulled it out, the object vanished. 1 second it was there, and the very next second it was gone, like a light bulb burning out. I told myself it was probably a drone, trying not to think that I could have just seen a flying saucer. People fly the drones out here sometimes, though rarely this late in the evening. I tried to shake it off, but this strange uneasiness had settled into my chest already. I was maybe half a mile from the trailhead when I heard it. A sound like someone walking behind me. I froze and felt my heart start to beat a little faster. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Just the trees and the now fading light. "Hello?" I called out, but there wasn't a response. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear anything, breathing, movement, anything, but there was nothing besides the sounds of the forest. So I shook it off and picked up my pace. But it seemed the faster I walked, the more I became aware of that sound again. Footsteps, echoing mine, perfectly in sync with me. I stopped. "Hello?" I called, more irritated than anything now, thinking that maybe somebody was messing with me. But still, nothing. The creepy part, though, was that the footsteps stopped when I did. After a few moments, that's when I first saw her. She was standing maybe 20 feet away, just off the trail. A woman about my age, with long dark hair, just like mine, and a red jacket. She was staring at me, completely still, her head tilted like she was curious. I asked her if she was okay, but she didn't answer. I took another step towards her, and that's when I realized something was very, very wrong. You see, she was wearing my jacket. I stopped in my tracks, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't just my jacket that she was wearing. She was wearing the same exact outfit as I was. The gray leggings, the hiking boots, even the blue baseball cap that I'd thrown on before leaving the house. And there was something about her face that could have almost been a resemblance of my own face. Like, maybe she was a relative or something. She didn't look exactly like me, but she looked enough like me to really creep me out, especially because she was wearing the same thing that I was. And then she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile either. It was thin and mechanical, like someone who had learned to smile by watching others, but having never felt the emotion behind a smile. "Who are you?" I asked, but my words were just a whisper. I wasn't even sure I wanted to know the answer. She didn't respond. Instead, she took a step closer, and that's when I bolted. I sprinted down the trail, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The crunch of my boots on the dirt path seemed deafening, and they drowned out any other sound because I was running so fast and so loudly. I didn't want to look back though, but there was a feeling in the air like static electricity, and it felt like that feeling was following me. The trailhead wasn't far, just a few more minutes of running, I told myself. My car would be there, and I could lock the doors, drive away, and leave this madness behind. But as I rounded the bend in the path, my blood turned to ice. Standing directly in the middle of the trail was that same woman. Me. Or at least some Timu doppelganger. The same red jacket, the gray leggings, the blue cap, everything. Except this wasn't possible. She hadn't passed me. I was sure of it. There was no way she could get ahead of me on that trail. She stood there, blocking the path, her head tilted in that same eerie angle. This time her smile was gone though, and was replaced by an expression I couldn't read. I skidded to a stop so fast I almost tripped in the process. "What do you want?" I yelled at her. But again, she didn't answer. Instead, she raised her arm and pointed to something behind me. Every instinct that I have started screaming at me not to turn around, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, I twisted my head to look over my shoulder. The trail behind me was empty, and when I turned back, she was gone. There was nowhere for her to go. I would be able to see her running through the forest, or at least hear her crashing through the leaves. But it was like she disappeared into thin air. No, I don't remember the rest of the run to my car. It was a blur of panic and adrenaline, but my body was moving on autopilot. All I know is that somehow I made it back to the trailhead, and I threw myself into the driver's seat. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm myself and trying to catch my breath. The lot was empty, except for my car. How did that woman even get all the way out there? The sky had already started to deepen into this bruised purple color, and the first stars were beginning to come out. It was over. Whatever I'd seen, whoever I'd seen, was gone. By the time I got home, the logical part of my brain had taken over, offering explanations. It was a prank, I thought. Someone had seen me on the trail before and mimicked my outfit to scare me. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold all over again. When I got out of the car and walked up to my front door, the porch light wasn't on. That was strange, because it's set on a timer to turn on automatically at sunset. I reached out to open the door, but it wasn't locked. I always lock my door. Always. Every time I leave the house. I went inside, despite my better judgment. The house was dark except for the glow of my computer screen in the office down the hall. My stomach twisted. I knew that I had turned off the screen before I left. I flipped on the light in the entry and asked who was there. I know. This is how stupid people get killed in scary movies all the time. And let's just say I learned my lesson. Anyways, all that I was greeted with was silence. I moved through the house, switching on every light as I went, checking every room. The living room, the kitchen, even the bathroom. Nothing was out of place. Everything looked exactly how I'd left it. Except for my bedroom. The closet door was open. I never leave my closet door open, especially at night. I shut it before bed. That's where I keep my gun, though. I'm a single woman. I live alone. Of course I have a gun. I stepped closer, shaking. I could already see the small metal case that the gun was in. It looked undisturbed, and I knew that the gun was still in there. I wasn't afraid that somebody had grabbed it, but I was damn sure going to grab it myself. So I stepped closer, shaking, as I reached for the light to switch it on inside. The bulb flickered to life, lighting up the rows of neatly hung up clothes and a few boxes stacked on the floor. At first, it all seemed normal. And then I saw it. That same red jacket. The same one the woman on the trail had been wearing. It was hanging neatly on a hanger, exactly where it should be. But I looked down at myself. I was wearing the damn jacket at the very moment. How in the hell could it be there too? I reached out, slowly. I touched the fabric, trying to decide if this was real or if I was in some incredibly real dream. The jacket was there. I could feel the fabric. It felt cold, like it had been left outside in the night air. I knew that what I was seeing wasn't a hallucination. Before I could even grab the gun case, though, I heard quick footsteps in the hall behind me. I spun around, facing the door, and actually screamed in fright, because she was standing there, staring at me. The woman, or whatever she was standing at the far end of the hallway, and her head still tilted in that unnatural way. Her smile was back, wider this time, stretching her lips to the point of creepiness. My body felt frozen, like my feet were glued to the floor. What are you? I tried to ask that, but my voice sounded small and useless to me, and was basically rustling leaves in the wind. She took a step forward. I backed up into the closet, my hand fumbling for something, anything I could use as a weapon. There wasn't time to grab the case, unlock it, and load it. I found a heavy flashlight and raised it like a club. She stopped and locked these dark eyes onto mine. That was the first thing that I noticed was actually different about her. I have blue eyes. Her eyes were so brown that they were almost black. And then she did something I will never, ever forget, even if I live to be 100 years old. She raised a hand, pointed it directly at me, and mouthed a single word. Run. This silent command to run struck me harder than if she'd screamed it at me. Something about her expression told me that whatever she wasn't bluffing. Without thinking, I bolted straight past her, down the hallway and out of the door. My only thought was to get out of the house and as far away from that woman as possible. I fumbled for the lock when I reached the door. My hands were trembling so badly I couldn't even do it at first, but finally I stumbled out into the night. The street was quiet. My neighbors' houses were dark. That was strange too. This neighborhood was usually busy with dogs barking or kids playing way after dark, and the neighbors were always outside talking with each other. Tonight, it was like I was the only one there. I ran to my car. I jumped inside. I didn't have a plan, but I knew that I couldn't stay near the house. The first thought that came to my mind was my brother Matt. He lived about 20 minutes away in an apartment. It was on the other side of town, but I knew that I could get there quickly. He'd believe me. He had to. The drive there felt like it took hours, and I glanced in the rearview more than once. I was trying to convince myself that she wasn't in the car with me. When I finally pulled into Matt's apartment complex, I practically leapt out of the car and sprinted to his door. "It's me! Open up!" I started yelling, and I was banging on the door. It creaked open, and my brother appeared, looking groggy and confused. I told him that something was really, really wrong, and I didn't know how to explain it. He ushered me inside and sat me down on the couch as I began to lose it. I looked around, wondering why he was already in bed. He told me it was after midnight. That was impossible. It shouldn't even be 8 o'clock. I looked at the clock. Sure enough, it was almost 1. I began to lose it. I told him everything. As I spoke, his face grew more serious, and I could tell that he looked worried for me. When I finished, he leaned back, ran his hand through his hair. "That's intense," is all he said. I got angry. I wanted him to freak out like I was freaking out. Not only did I see some woman that looked a lot like me and was wearing the exact same outfit as me, but she reappeared out of nowhere. Then she was in my house, and now, missing time? What in the hell was going on? I told him I wasn't crazy. He told me he knew that. I told him that the woman was real, and that she appeared out of nowhere. I told him that I was missing time. I told him that I didn't think that woman was human. The look on his face was more like it after that. Now he looked nervous too. But I don't know if he was nervous at the thought that I was going crazy, or that something paranormal really was happening. He told me I was staying there that night, regardless of what was going on. I didn't have a problem with that. That night, after several drinks, I finally fell asleep. I dreamt of the woman. In the dream, I was back on the trail. The forest was darker this time though, and she was standing on the ridge. She was staring out over the valley, and I approached her calmly. When I did, she turned to face me. But her smile was gone, replaced with this sadness. And then she told me that I was the one that didn't belong there. Her voice sounded so sad that it made me feel sad. But I could think only one thought. Why was I the one that didn't belong here? She pointed down to the valley below. It wasn't the familiar view of my hometown though. It was a landscape that I didn't even recognize, and it was glowing this eerie red light. I looked back at her, and she was close enough to reach out and touch me at that point. When she did, she told me none of this was real. I woke up in a panic. I got up, I looked around the apartment. I checked the locks and sat down on the couch, and I didn't go back to sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dream and the woman were trying to tell me something, and that it wasn't a coincidence that I had had dreams about her. Whatever she was, I felt that now she was capable of entering my dreams too. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to go back to my house, not after everything that had happened. And Maddie let me crash at his place while I tried to figure out my next move. The woman, or whatever, hadn't appeared again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she still was with me somehow. And on the third day, I decided to go back to the trail. As terrified as I was, I felt like the truth was there. Maybe if I retraced my steps, I'd find something to explain what was happening. Matt tried to talk me out of it at first, but I had made up my mind. He insisted on coming with me after that. He wasn't thrilled about the plan, but he could see how determined I was, and he didn't want me going alone. I wasn't even convinced that he believed me at that point. We got to the trailhead in the early afternoon. The parking lot was empty, the way it always was during the week. We walked in silence for a while, and as we climbed higher, my stomach was a mess of fear and anticipation. When we reached the ridge, I stopped and looked out over the valley. It was beautiful, just like I remembered, just like always. I made a quick glance down at the valley below. It was the view that I always knew. Matt asked what I was looking for, but I hadn't the slightest clue. We stood there for a few minutes until I noticed something weird near the edge of the ridge. There was a patch of ground where the grass and the plants looked wrong. They looked almost pixelated, like a low-resolution image or something. I asked Matt if he saw it, even pointing out what I was looking at, but he didn't see the same thing as me. I went to the patch of pixelated ground, but as I did, I felt a wave of dizziness pop up out of nowhere. It felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. I remember getting dizzy. I remember feeling faint, and then everything was black. The world around me changed in an instant. One moment, I was standing on the ridge with my brother. The next, I was somewhere else entirely. The forest was gone, the sky was flat. It was featureless and white, and the ground beneath me felt hard and cold like metal. I tried calling out to my brother, but there was no answer. I turned around and saw her, the woman. She was standing a few feet away. Her expression was calm but serious. She wasn't smiling. She said I wasn't supposed to be there. I yelled at her, asking where here even was. What she said, I still have trouble understanding. I don't know what it means, even if I have my own theories about what she could have been talking about. She said, "The edge." I asked what in the hell she was talking about, but she ignored me, telling me that I wasn't supposed to see this, that I wasn't supposed to be there, and that I had seen too much. She told me that I had to go. Before I could even ask her anything else, she looked over her shoulder, like she was sensing something that I couldn't. When she looked back at me, her expression was dark, and I still remember seeing a hint of concern on her face. Was it concern for me? And then for a moment, I felt weightless, like I was floating in nothingness. Then, just as suddenly, I was back on the ridge. I was sitting down on the ground, my arms wrapped around my knees, and Matt was yelling at me. Only I had no recollection of sitting down, or how I was wrapping my hands around my knees like that. I looked up at him, confused, until I remembered what I had just witnessed. What I saw when I was gone slowly came back to me, like I was remembering some weird twisted dream. But I assure you, what I saw, it wasn't a dream. My brother was beside himself. He was trying to figure out what had happened to me, but I just had him help me up and asked if we could leave. My whole body felt weird, like I wasn't exactly inside of my body, but rather letting someone else drive, if that makes any sense at all. All I know is that I felt calm on the walk back to the car, even though Matt was anything but calm. I wish I could say that I've forgotten what happened, but I can't. The memory of that woman, of that strange, empty world that she showed me, it still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear faint footsteps in the hallway, or even catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I don't know if it's her, or if it's something else, or if it's just my imagination. Hell, at this point, it wouldn't be my luck to not have a ghost in my house either. I can't even begin to try to understand anything I saw, but my theory is that this world isn't what we think it is. It's a construct, or a simulation, like playing The Sims, but on a worldly level, and more complicated and fragile. Like maybe something celestial is out there, simulating our lives. I know that it sounds crazy. Believe me, I wish I had never seen any of it. I used to be a boring woman that didn't know much of anything. Now I feel like I'm crazy just talking about it. And so I don't tell a lot of people. I feel safe here, and maybe there'll be some theories that I can read. But most of the time, I keep all of that to myself. I even went as far as to talk with a doctor about what I'd seen. She put me through a bunch of tests, even checked for a brain tumor. But all of that came back normal. The only explanation I have left is that I really did experience it. For the purposes of this story, I'm going to make up names to protect our real identities. My name is Laura, I'm married to David, and we have a son named Ben. Our life in the early 90s was as ordinary as it could be. We lived in Columbus, Ohio, with a big backyard where Ben loved to play. I worked part-time as a librarian, and David was the manager at a grocery store. Ben was our miracle baby. After years of trying, he came into our lives one December morning in 1986. From the start, he was a sharp, curious child, always asking questions far beyond his years. He loved puzzles, building blocks, and playing make-believe. Like most parents, David and I took pride in how bright he was. But everything changed one afternoon in April of 1992, when Ben said something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon. David was out in the garage working on an old car, and I was folding laundry in the living room while Ben played on the floor with his toys. He'd been unusually quiet for a while, his little brows furrowed as he arranged his trucks. "Mom, do you remember the big house I had, with the white fence and the garden?" I was confused, and I asked him what house he was talking about. This was the only house he should remember living in. Ben glanced up at me, and his face was so sincere. "The one I lived in before I was here. It had lots of flowers, and I used to sit on the porch with my dog." I smiled, assuming he was just making up a story. I told him that sounded nice and asked what type of dog he had, thinking I was playing along with his game. You know how kids are. He told me he had a golden retriever, and his name was Buddy, and that Buddy didn't like the neighbor's cat. The specifics of his answer caught me off guard, and I asked him where the house was. He told me by a lake, and that it was sunny all the time. I didn't think much of it then. Kids have wild imaginations after all. But over the next few weeks, Ben started talking more and more about the time before. He described things no 5-year-old could have experienced or known about. Details that became difficult to dismiss. One evening after dinner, Ben was drawing in the kitchen while I was washing the dishes. Out of nowhere, he said, "Mom, do you think Buddy misses me?" I turned to look at him and asked who Buddy was, having forgotten about the dog. "My dog," he answered, as if I should already know the answer. "From when I was a grown-up, we used to walk by the lake every morning, even when it was cold." I sat down at the table, drying my hands on the dish towel. "Ben, when you say, when you were grown up, what do you mean?" He sighed, the way a child does when they think their parent just isn't getting it. "Before I came here, I was a man. I had a big house and a wife. Her name was Evelyn. She liked to bake pies, and she was really good at it." I felt a chill creep up my spine for some reason. I guess it was my brain beginning to think something else might be going on. I asked where this was, but he told me he didn't know the name. He just knew that it was sunny all the time, and it was always warm, and there was a big tree in the yard. He stopped to think for a minute. I remember his brow furrowing as he thought, and then his eyes lit up, and he looked at me. "It was an oak tree," he told me. David walked in at that moment, catching the look on my face and asking if everything was okay. I nodded quickly, not wanting to alarm him, but that night I told David everything Ben had said. He laughed it off, saying kids have vivid imaginations, and that it was probably something that Ben had seen in a book or on TV. I wanted to agree with him, but something about the way Ben spoke, the confidence in his voice, made it hard to just brush off. As the weeks went on, Ben's stories became even more elaborate. He began describing his job and his other life. I worked in a tall building. I sat at a big desk with lots of papers. People would come in and ask me questions all the time. I asked what kind of questions, and he told me they were questions about money. I asked if he was a banker, but he shook his head. I watched him sit there, concentrating, trying to remember what he did, and then his eyes lit up the same way as before. "It's called an accountant." I stared at him, stunned, absolutely lost for words. How could he know about accountants? We didn't work in anything remotely related to finances, and we certainly hadn't talked about it around him. Another day, while we were driving to the grocery store, he pointed out the window and said, "That car looks like the one I used to drive." I glanced at the vehicle he was pointing to. It was an old black Cadillac. It was nothing like our current sedan, and we didn't know anyone who owned a Cadillac. "What kind of car was it?" I asked, half afraid of the answer. "A Cadillac," he said confidently. "I had to sell it when Evelyn got sick. We needed the money for her medicine." Again, I was floored. How could my little boy know so many things that a 5-year-old couldn't possibly know? And then the most settling moment came one night when Ben was playing with his toy blocks. He'd built a tower and was pretending it was an office building. "Mom, did you know Evelyn had curly brown hair? She liked to wear it in a braid when she worked in the garden." I froze, creeped out and desperate for answers. I asked how he knew all this. He tilted his head, like the answer was obvious. "I just remember. It's like a dream I had, but I know it's real. Do you think Evelyn's okay now?" Honestly, I didn't know what to say. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. Later that same night, after Ben was asleep, I sat down with David and told him everything. This time he didn't laugh. He just listened, deep in thought. He finally offered that maybe Ben had heard it somewhere, or read about these things somewhere. I reminded him that Ben was 5. He couldn't even read yet. I asked him where Ben could have heard about so many adult things in that specific of a detail. He never went anywhere without us. David didn't have an answer. Neither did I. A few weeks after Ben started talking about Evelyn, he introduced another layer of his story. His old parents. David was fixing a leaky faucet in the bathroom, and I was reading a book on the couch. He was playing and humming softly to himself. And out of nowhere he said, "Mom, Do you think my other mom and dad miss me? I looked up from my book, startled. What do you mean? He kept his eyes on the train tracks and didn't look at me as he talked. My old mom and dad, before I came here. Tell me about them. I said it as gently as possible, trying not to let my unease show, even though I could feel my heart beating faster. They were nice. My mom had blonde hair, like yours, but shorter. She used to sing to me when I was little. What did she sing? I asked. He furrowed his brow in concentration once again. It was funny. It was about a rooster. I don't remember all the words, though. I nodded, urging him to continue. What about your dad? He was tall. He wore a hat a lot, like the kind you wear when you go fishing. He used to take me to the park all the time. I asked where they lived, hoping I could figure out where he was getting all of this information, praying that it was just his vivid imagination and that I was overreacting. He told me it was like where we lived, but the house was bigger and there were lots of hills. The street went up and down, and you could see really far at the top. My heart started beating even faster. This couldn't just be imagination. I asked him if he remembered what city that he lived in with his parents, but he didn't for some reason. He just said it was windy there, not like how warm it was when he was a grown-up. I didn't know what to make of it. Ben spoke with confidence, like he was talking about a memory, not imagining the story. I decided to press further. What happened to them, Ben? Your old mom and dad? He frowned and set down his train. I don't know. I just remember that one day I wasn't there anymore. I woke up and I was here instead. Once again, after Ben was asleep, I sat down with David. I expected him to laugh at me or dismiss it, but instead, he actually looked troubled this time. His concern was growing, just like mine. He thought it was weird, and he pointed out the consistency of Ben's story. Like he wasn't just making it up as he went. I asked him what he thought it meant, hoping he'd have some miracle answer for me, but all he could say was maybe it was his imagination, or maybe he had dreamt all of this stuff, and it made it feel real to him. There wasn't any other rational explanation. As the summer went on, Ben continued to share snippets of his past life, always in the same calm, matter-of-fact tone. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, he mentioned something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He told me he thought his mom's old name was Margaret, and that his dad's name was Thomas. I asked how he knew that, and he said he just remembered it. He also told me that both of his old parents called him their little man. The names Margaret and Thomas didn't mean anything to me or David, but they felt significant somehow. Ben was so confident in his memories, and the more he talked about them, the harder it became to dismiss them as imagination. Then one afternoon, Ben was drawing in the living room and came up to me with a picture. It was of his other life. He was there with Margaret and Thomas, a blonde woman and a man with brown hair. They were standing with a little boy that really resembled Ben. The only thing is, it couldn't have been us because David has blonde hair. He told me it was a picture of his old house when he was little, before he was a grown-up and married to Evelyn. He pointed at the man and said that was Thomas, his old dad, and the woman was Margaret, his old mom. I asked who the little boy was, and he said it was Michael, his name before he came to us. I asked him if he remembered anything else new, and he stood there with his face scrunched up, thinking. And then he said something I will never, ever forget as long as I live. There was something going on. People were fighting somewhere else. I think they were having a war with a man named Charlie. How could he know about wars that happened before he was born, let alone that term? I couldn't breathe. The photo and this new information was undeniable proof that something strange was happening, something I couldn't explain. And it seemed like the more time that passed, the more he remembered. I was starting to think that he was remembering some past life, except I didn't believe in reincarnation. Not like that. But all the things that Ben was telling me was making me reevaluate my beliefs. I felt a mix of dread and determination. I couldn't just ignore this anymore. It was too specific. It was too real. That night, while David and Ben were asleep, I stayed up late with the picture, staring at the little boy that Ben had drawn. Michael. That was the night I actually started thinking that it was possible that Ben really was having memories of a past life. It only got worse from there. He drew more and more pictures. He drew pictures of himself as a child in a backyard of his old house, pictures of his dog, even pictures of a woman with dark hair with a man standing next to her. He told me that was Evelyn, and the man was him as a grown-up. By now, the situation was far beyond anything David or I could handle alone. I reached out to a psychologist who specialized in children, Dr. Morris. During our first session, I explained everything Ben had been saying and drawing. Dr. Morris suggested something I hadn't considered: past life regression. She explained that there were documented cases of children who recalled vivid details of lives they couldn't possibly have experienced. I hadn't expected much when we agreed to try past life regression. I mean, Ben was only 5 at the time, and the idea of hypnosis felt a little far-fetched. But after months of hearing him talk about Evelyn, Margaret, Thomas, and Buddy, we were desperate for answers. The session took place in her office towards the end of the summer. She started by putting him in this big recliner and telling him he was going for an adventure in his mind, and that it would be okay to remember things, but it would also be okay if he didn't remember anything. He acted like it was just a normal thing. He shrugged and agreed to it. She guided him into what she told us was a relaxed state. She asked him to imagine floating on a cloud. Then she started talking to him, asking questions, requesting that he tell her what he could remember. He said he was in his backyard playing fetch with Buddy. He could smell his mom cooking dinner from the open window in the kitchen. She always let him play in the backyard when she cooked because she could watch him from the kitchen window. She asked what his mom called him. He told her Michael and her little man. I felt a lump in my throat as I listened. It matched what he had already told us. During the past life regression session, Ben's memories of his life as Michael and this impossible other childhood flowed naturally. But what surprised us most were the glimpses of his life as an adult, memories tied to this Evelyn woman. Dr. Morris asked Ben to move forward in time during the session, asking what happened later in his life. He told her about Evelyn, his wife. He told Dr. Morris that Evelyn was tall and had dark hair, and that she laughed a lot. They lived in an apartment in the city. It had a balcony, and they would sit out there and read together. He told Dr. Morris that he didn't remember the city's name, but he could smell bread sometimes, especially when he was on the balcony, and that he could see tall buildings. She asked what his job was, and he again said he was an accountant. He said that when he came home from work, Evelyn would make coffee for them, and they would sit on the balcony and talk. When Dr. Morris asked what they would talk about, Ben said they would talk about a lot of stuff. Evelyn wanted to move to a house one day and get a dog, but she was sick, and that's why they couldn't have kids. Dr. Morris asked what else happened in his life as Michael, but he wouldn't say anything more, just that it didn't last. I wanted to stop the session. I was terrified that if this was truly happening, he would remember the death of his past life, and that terrified me more than anything else I could think of. Dr. Morris's expression didn't waver. I could see the concern in her eyes, too. She told Ben he didn't have to talk about it anymore if he didn't want to. The last thing Ben said during this regression session was that he remembers floating as Michael. Dr. Morris asked where he was floating. I remember his words exactly. I'll never forget them. To another place. It's warm, and I feel safe. Then I'm here with Mom and Dad, and I know that they'll take care of me. We ended the session after that. I couldn't take any more of it. Dr. Morris was just as baffled as us. Ben just acted like nothing had happened. He even asked if we can go get ice cream on the way home. Dr. Morris told us that whether we believed in reincarnation or not, it's clear that these experiences feel very real to Ben. That night, as we were tucking him into bed, he lifted his head and told us that he was happy he got to talk about Michael, but that he thought it was time to stop talking about it now. I've never been so relieved in my life. I admit, I was curious though, and I asked him why he wanted to stop talking about it now. He told me it was because he was Ben now, and he was happy to be here with us as his parents. True to his word, Ben stopped mentioning his past life after that day. He went back to being an ordinary 5-year-old boy, playing with his toys, asking endless questions about the world around him. But I couldn't forget what we had seen, or what we heard. The memories, the details, the recognition, it all pointed to something I couldn't explain. David and I agreed not to push Ben for more answers. For weeks after the regression, David and I replayed the session in our minds. It was hard to reconcile what Ben had said. What we understood about life and death was called into question. The way he described floating, the light, it all sounded so otherworldly. But that day made us both believers that we, as humans, can't grasp the concept of everything. At least not yet. Years passed, and the memories Ben had shared with us just became something in our own past. At first, David and I waited for him to bring it up again, but as time went on, it became clear that he had moved on from it. He grew into a bright, thoughtful young man. He excelled in school, made lifelong friends, and eventually went to college. If he ever even remembered his claims about being Michael, he didn't mention them. Not even once. Decades later, Ben is now a father himself, and I'm a proud grandma to 4 little hellions. He and his wife Emily have 2 beautiful daughters, Bella and Madeline, and 2 rambunctious sons, Benjamin and Lucas. Watching him with his kids brings me an immense joy. He's a devoted father, playful and patient, and I often catch glimpses of the boy he used to be in the way that he interacts with those kids. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened, but I've come to accept it as one of life's mysteries. Maybe Ben really was Michael in another life, or maybe it was something else, something beyond comprehension. Maybe he just started his life over when the other one was finished. With the internet at our fingertips now, it might be easy to find Thomas, Margaret, and Michael. The Michael who eventually married Evelyn. But I don't think I want to know. And I sure do not want Ben remembering these things if he doesn't have to. I would hate to read how any of them met their end. I think that would just be something that unnerved me. He's here now, in this life, and it doesn't matter where he was before it. He's my son. His children are my grandkids, and I love them all with everything that I have. One thing that I do know for certain, Ben is here living a full life of love and laughter. And after all, that's the only thing that matters. Forgive me for the length of this message, but I wanted to write down everything I could remember. I feel every detail matters in this situation. I've been working on this for quite some time now, but I think it's finally ready, at least to the point where I can share the most bizarre thing that has ever happened to me. I would love to hear what other people think. Did I shift into another dimension? Or did the Matrix people say we're living in glitch? Or am I just going mad? My name is Callum. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in a small village near Inverness, which is a place in Scotland for those of you that don't know. I work as a civil engineer, and I live with my wife Fiona and our 2 daughters, Isla and Ilid. Life has always been predictable for me. Work, family, the occasional trip into the Highlands for a bit of hiking. I've been happy with life. I love my family. But I do believe that something is wrong with this reality. Hear me out before you make any conclusions. Like most people, I've always had a nostalgic streak. I think it comes from losing my parents young. You see, my mom passed away when I was in university, and my dad followed a few years later. Memories of my childhood are precious, and I've clung to them tightly. Growing up in Dunrobin, a street of neat little terraced houses, was delightful. The neighborhood was delightful too. The games we played as children were so much fun, and the warmth of my mom's cooking is something that I both treasure and miss terribly. All of this formed a kind of haven in my mind. I hadn't been back to Dunrobin in years. Life gets in the way. You know what they say. Once you go down one hill, you go down them all. And after my dad sold the house, I didn't see much of a reason to visit Dunrobin anymore. But last June, during a lull at work and around my dad's birthday, I decided to take a drive. Fiona and the girls were at her parents', and I had time on my hands. It felt like the right moment to reconnect with my old roots, a way to sort of be with my dad on his birthday. The village hadn't changed much when I arrived. The old stone bridge over the burn was still there, the same as it had been since the 19th century. The little pub on the corner still had its worn wooden sign, but something about the air felt off to me. Maybe it was the strange haze in the late afternoon light, or the way my stomach tightened the closer I got to my old home. I parked the car near the entrance to the street. As I stepped out, I looked down the row of houses. A stab of apprehension clung to me. The layout was the same, but the details didn't sit right. The houses were different. Paint colors I didn't recognize, extensions that seemed out of place. I just chalked it up to the passage of time. After all, it had been over 2 decades since I'd lived there. But then I reached my old house, number 14. The first thing that struck me was the door. It wasn't red anymore, but a dull green. That I could have explained away. People repaint doors. They repaint houses too. But it was the house itself that was wrong. The windows were smaller, and the bay window in the living room was gone. The garden was barren, save for a few weeds poking through the gravel. I stood there for a long time, trying to accept the memory in front of me with one of my memories. So finally, I just knocked. An older man answered, probably in his late 60s. He had a kindly face, but looked at me curiously. I said something to the likes of, I used to live there decades ago, and I was wondering if I could have a quick look around for old time's sake. This man looked at me like I was dumb, asking me if I was sure that I had the right house. I told him I was certain. Number 14. I'd lived there from the time I was about 6 years old until I went off to university. He shook his head and told me he'd lived there for 30 years. I blinked, certain that I'd misheard. Are you sure? My parents were Alistair and Margaret. We moved into the house around 1989. He shook his head slowly. Sorry, but that doesn't ring a bell. I bought this house in 1986, and the couple before me didn't have kids. My stomach sank, because that couldn't be right. I grew up there. I could tell you exactly where my bedroom was. The one at the back. It had a sloping ceiling. I proceeded to tell him all of that, but he just shook his head and told me there wasn't a room back there. Then he told me there was only 2 rooms upstairs, and that they were both in the front. This was impossible. I think he felt sorry for me, or at least he was curious to figure out why this crazy man was at his doorstep. He invited me in to see for myself. I took a deep breath before I entered. What I found, I still can't explain to this day. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. The layout was completely different. The hallway leading to the kitchen was gone, replaced by an open-plan living room. The staircase was on the wrong side, and the rooms upstairs were, as the man said, limited to 2 at the front of the house. I wandered through in confusion, my memories fighting with reality with what I was seeing. I pointed out spots where I remembered certain things. Mum's sewing table, the cupboard where we kept the board games, but none of it matched what I was seeing now. It was like being in a daydream, where everything was familiar but fundamentally wrong. As I stared at the wall where we used to keep our family pictures, he came up to me and asked if I was okay. I looked over and gave a small smile, telling him I must have been mistaken, even though I knew, for a bleeding fact, I was not mistaken. He apologized, like it had been his fault. I thanked him and left, my head spinning. I decided to knock on a few other doors. Certainly, someone would remember me or my family. Mrs. Henderson, who lived at number 12, had been like a second grandmother to me, always handing out biscuits and tea. When a woman answered the door, I recognized her immediately. Or at least, I thought I did. She looked older, of course, but unmistakably her. Mrs. Henderson? I asked her. She squinted at me. Yes? Do I know you? It's Callum Stewart. I used to live next door. Her face lit up briefly, but the recognition I was hoping for didn't come. She told me that I was mistaken, that the people that lived next door were the Donovans. But then she became weirdly quiet, and I could swear I saw her eyes mist over. She started to say something about the boy that lived there, but stopped. I asked what she was going to say. She told me the Donovan's son had passed away when he was only 16 years old. My mind was reeling. What in the hell was going on? I felt frustrated, to the point where I started to argue with this poor old woman. I told her that was me, that I used to play in her garden and help with the pies that she would bake. She looked at me like I was the one that was nuts, and told me that I needed to leave. That she didn't know me, and that whoever this other kid was had helped her, not me. I mumbled an apology, and then she shut the door on me. I stood on the pavement, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Honestly, Mrs. Henderson's reaction rattled me. Her memories were my memories, except for one impossible detail. I wasn't in them. There was this other boy, a stranger, who seemed to have lived my life, and he died years ago. I knocked on a few more doors. I needed someone to remember me. Most of the people that answered were new families that I didn't know, so I moved on, trying to find someone that still lived there. I was beginning to panic, though. What was happening to me? By the time I reached number 2, where my best friend Jamie had lived, my nerves were frayed. We'd been close growing up, riding our bikes through the woods, building forts, and all the other stuff little boys do. I'd lost touch with him, though, through the years, and I was praying that he still lived on Dunrobin. A middle-aged woman answered the door. It wasn't Jamie. I told her that I was looking for Jamie Sinclair. I used to be a friend of his. She smiled politely, but told me that Jamie had passed away in a car accident. He was only 21 years old when it happened. My heart fell, not only because he was my only hope, but because he was gone. I apologized for her loss, and she asked my name. I told her it was Callum, and she smiled again. She mentioned him being close with the Callum, and I finally felt hope that I was looking for. I told her that was me, but she shook her head. What she said next sent me into pure confusion and dread. I'm sorry, I was talking about Callum Donovan. He passed away too. Jamie never really got over that. I thanked her and walked away in a haze. My thoughts were spinning like a storm at this point. I took out my phone and searched for old records. I found nothing linking my family to the address. It was as if we'd never lived there, but I knew that we had. I could still picture my mom standing in the kitchen, humming as she cooked, or my dad fixing the leaky tap in the bathroom. I remember the smell of the attic, the creak of the floorboards in the hallway, and the little hide-and-seek nook under the stairs. By the time I got back to the car, I could barely think straight. My memories felt like shards of glass, sharp and disconnected. I couldn't make sense of it. I knew who I was, who my family was, and the life that we lived. But here, in this place, nobody else did. None of it seemed to have happened, and I didn't seem to have existed. I sat in the car for a long time. The boy who had taken my place, Callum Donovan, was real in this version of events. He had lived my life, played with my friends, and he died young. But where did that leave me? The drive back to Edinburgh was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I felt like I didn't know what was real anymore. When I finally pulled into my driveway, Fiona greeted me at the door. She took one look at me and frowned. The excitement of having been back from her mom's and seeing me was gone. I lied to her, though, telling her I was fine. She pushed me for more details, but I brushed it off, mumbling something about work stress. I couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. How could I explain something that I didn't understand myself? That night after dinner, I sat in my study, and I spent hours online searching for any trace of Callum Donovan or records of his death. I found nothing beyond a brief obituary in an old local newspaper. That confirmed that he had died, at least. It was a biking accident in 2001. No photos, no family history, no social media footprints, just a name and a date. But the more I looked, the more I felt strange. I had this feeling that this boy had somehow replaced me. Or maybe I had replaced him. A week later, my anxiety had only grown. I began noticing little things that didn't quite align with my memories. A framed photo on the living room wall showed my wedding to Fiona, but her dress looked subtly different. Shorter sleeves and no lace trim. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, a side effect of the visit to Dunrobin, but then something happened that I couldn't explain away. I was digging through an old box of childhood mementos, hoping to find more proof of my past. Among the toys and school certificates, I found a crumpled piece of paper, a drawing that I'd made as a boy. It was of a house labeled My Home, except it wasn't the house that I remembered. The drawing matched the version of number 14 that exists now. The smaller windows, no bay window, the green door. My name, written in childish scrawl, was at the bottom. My breath caught. I hadn't remembered drawing this, and I certainly wouldn't have drawn the house in that picture. I would have drawn the house that I remembered. I stared at that picture until my vision blurred and I could feel my pulse racing in my temples. Was it possible that my memories were wrong? That I wasn't who I thought I was? One evening, Fiona found me staring at the old drawing that I'd uncovered. She asked what it was, and I told her it was a picture of the house that I lived in as a child. But she looked perplexed and said, "I thought you said you had a bay window." I told her I did. I didn't know why the picture didn't. I felt a little bit of relief, knowing that at least Fiona had heard the story of the bay window. I wanted to tell her everything, to visit to Dunrobin with me, but how everything was different in ways that I couldn't explain. The doubts were eating away at my sense of self. But how could I tell her any of this? She'd think I was mad. Truthfully, I was unraveling inside, but I was trying to hold it together for her and our girls. One day, as I researched all of this shit, I came across a message board and read a theory that I couldn't shake from my mind. It was about people who grew up somewhere, only to come back and find that things aren't the way they remembered it. It's like they've stepped into a different version of their lives, like the past had been rewritten or something. One thing I read there said something about land being cursed because of a broken pact or an unfulfilled promise. According to the person that posted it, that can create a fracture, like a seam that doesn't quite hold together. People who get too close sometimes slip through. I don't know if it's true. I doubt it. But if it is, maybe I slipped into the wrong side. The idea seemed absurd, yet I couldn't deny that it fit. It explained the inconsistencies, the feeling of being out of place, the way my past had been overwritten by another version of myself. If I'd slipped through, was it possible to find my way back? Or was I trapped in a life that wasn't mine? That night I had a dream that was so vivid, it still feels like it was real. And I can't help but think that maybe it wasn't just a dream. Maybe it was an out-of-body experience. In my dream, I returned to Dunrobin. The street was quiet, almost eerily so. I stood outside number 14, staring at the green door. I didn't knock this time. Instead, I walked around back, knowing I had to go into the garden. It was empty, overgrown with weeds, but in the corner, half buried in the dirt, I saw something. I knelt down and unearthed it. It was a rusted bicycle frame, bent and broken. At that point, a memory surged through me. I don't think this was part of a dream because it was so sharp and vivid. I was racing down the hill behind the house. I could actually feel the wind in my hair. I could hear the sound of Jamie laughing beside me. But then the image flickered, and I saw something else. A teenager, who I just knew was Callum Donovan. He was lying crumpled on the ground. His bike was twisted beneath him. My stomach churned, and then I woke up. Who was I? Had I lived this life at all? I sat there in bed, with Fiona sleeping soundly next to me. I was feeling a deep, unsettling pull inside of me. The memory, if it was even mine, was so vivid, it left me trembling. It didn't make much sense. If I had died on that bike all those years ago, then who was I now? And if I hadn't, why did that place insist on erasing my existence? I was a mess that day. I called out sick from work, stayed on the computer for hours, just trying to find anything that could help. I even considered finding a medium or something that could help me. When Fiona and the kids were there, I tried to put on a happy face, but I didn't even know if they were my wife and kids. This was all really happening. It wasn't some movie where I could just break a curse or vanquish a ghost. Real paranormal things happen all the time. 2 nights later, I had another dream. I returned to Dunrobin one last time. The street was empty and it was nighttime. I could feel the breeze on my skin again. There I was, right in front of number 14 again. I yelled to no one specific that I didn't belong there and that this wasn't my life. My breath stopped when I heard someone say my name. When I turned to look towards the sound, I saw the brightest, most golden light I could have ever seen. In that light was a face I hadn't seen in years. It was my mom. Even in this dream, if you insist on calling it that anyway, I missed her terribly, and the sight of her was a relief and completely overwhelming. She told me I was never meant to come back, but I didn't know what she meant. Instead of elaborating, she just told me that everything was going to be okay. She reached out to touch me, but the world around me seemed to shimmer, as if the air itself was rippling. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I felt different, like the weight of everything I was going through was lifted. I knew that everything was going to be okay after that, and that everything was how it was supposed to be again. I can't explain it, but I felt it in my bones. I drove to Dunrobin one more time. The house had changed again. The bay window was back and the door was red. Was it possible? Had I somehow returned to my version of reality? Life returned to normal after that. My memories matched my surroundings again, and the world felt solid beneath my feet. But I couldn't forget what had happened. Every now and then, I still catch myself staring at my reflection in the mirror, wondering if it was really me. I can't explain it to this day, but I think what happened is I fell through that crack in reality, or the matrix we live in glitched or something, and I got sent to the wrong place until they pulled me back. I know it happened though. I know I was somewhere I shouldn't be. I know I talked to my mom in that dream, and I know I shared memories with someone that lived the same life as me until he died. I can't help but feeling that maybe that dream where I saw my mom, which I still don't consider it a dream. I think it was more of another out-of-body experience. But I think what happened was, wherever she was, she knew that I was in trouble. And she managed to finally find me again. Talk to me, make me feel better, and pull me out of whatever different reality that I was in. Even though she's gone, and had been for a long time, she still found a way to take care of her little boy. I really want to know what people think. Was it a glitch? Was it some other timeline? I don't know, but I'm very curious to find out. I hope this finds you in good health. Sincerely, Callum Stewart. Definitely not Callum Donovan. I'm Chris. I'm 29 years old. I live in a small apartment. Nothing special. One bedroom, a kitchen that barely fits the essentials, and a small living room that's mostly just a place to crash after a long day. I work a 9-to-5 job as a clerk. I like to keep things low-key. No roommates or anything. But I do have a few close friends that I see on weekends, mostly just for casual dinners or going and seeing movies. The first night that I noticed anything weird, I was out with my friend Miles. We'd been talking and catching up, so we decided to meet up at a restaurant that we both liked. It was just this hole-in-the-wall kind of place, but the food was good and the vibe was relaxed, the kind of place where you could just kick back and chat. We sat in a booth by the window, talking about all the usual stuff. I remember laughing at something Miles said about his latest failure on online dating, when I happened to glance around the room. Across the restaurant, sitting alone at a table, was a man who didn't have a face. At first, I thought maybe the dim lighting was playing tricks on me, or maybe I wasn't paying enough attention. But there he was, just sitting there, perfectly still, with smooth skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. He didn't acknowledge me or anyone else. He just sat there, like anyone else would. I looked over at Miles, pointing to the man, but when I looked back, there was a face like a normal person. I froze, and my mind started racing. I told myself I must have misjudged the angle, or my brain was being weird from the dim light. Maybe he was wearing some kind of bizarre mask. But none of it really made sense to me because I was absolutely sure of what I saw. Miles was mid-sentence, and I couldn't focus on anything that he was saying. All I could do was keep my eyes on the dude across the room. He didn't seem odd. Now he just looked normal. When I looked again, the man was gone. Just like that. Like he vanished into thin air. I glanced around the room to see if anyone else had noticed him, or if he could have been somewhere else in the room. But everyone was too busy with their own meals or conversations to notice the weirdo without a face, and he definitely wasn't somewhere else in the room. We went on with our conversation like nothing happened, but I couldn't keep it out of my mind. It just kept drifting to that weird experience. What the hell had I just seen? I tried to brush it off. I told myself it had to have been my imagination. Right? I mean, everybody has a face. Miles and I finished up our meal. We were chatting and laughing, but I kept wondering if some weird optical illusion or a prank was responsible for it. Maybe I'd missed the point of it. I told myself I'd figure it out eventually, and I went home after we parted ways. It wasn't until the day after when the real oddities started happening. I was finishing up some work at my desk when I noticed something strange. The clock on my computer screen flickered. It was one of those weird little glitches you don't think much of at first, but when it flickered backwards. Then it happened again. The time went backwards by a few minutes. About 4:15 instead of 4:18. I thought maybe I'd misread it. A 5 and an 8 can look kind of similar if you're tired, but then I looked again, and the same thing happened. The time flipped backwards and then jumped forward again, like time was skipping around or something. I pulled out my phone to check. Maybe my computer had a virus or something. But the same thing happened there. A few minutes had disappeared. I stared at the screen, unsure of what I was even looking at. I tried restarting my phone, but it didn't help. By then, I was starting to get just a little bit freaked out. I was looking at my watch to compare it with my phone, but both devices showed the same thing. I looked at the clock in the hallway. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was just some weird bug. But the clock in the hallway was doing the same thing. When I got to my car and started it to leave for the day, my car's clock flickered too, then reset itself a few seconds later. The ride home itself felt longer than it should have. I tried to tell myself I was just exhausted, but the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't ignore the sense that something was just different. Every little glitch felt like a pattern, but it was a pattern that I couldn't make sense of. When I finally got home, I sat on the couch, just staring at the wall. The time was slipping in and out of sync, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. The faceless man in the restaurant was starting to feel like more than just a weird coincidence. Maybe it was the first sighting of something strange. Maybe I hadn't imagined it after all. I was still thinking about it when I checked the time on my phone again. It was 8:15 p.m., but a second later, I saw the time jump back to 8:13. It wasn't possible for every clock around me to be doing this. No glitch or virus could explain this. Especially when you consider the fact that two of the clocks that I were looking at, the one on my wall and the one at work, were old analog clocks. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just imagining things. Something was definitely happening. Something was making the world around me glitch. I thought about the faceless man again. Maybe it wasn't a random encounter after all. Maybe everything was connected. Or maybe I was just going crazy. But the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. The next day, I called in sick. I was tired, freaked out, and not even wanting to go outside. Of course, nothing friggin' happened the entire day. I spent the whole day obsessed with time. I would check the wall clock, my phone, my watch, even the clock on the stove. Nothing seemed weird, and there were no time glitches. I mocked myself about it. Maybe I was just exhausted, or being dumb. That night, I tried to get back to normal. I needed to clear my head, and I thought maybe a drive would help. It was something routine. So I hopped in the car and tried to forget the stupid glitches from the night before. But of course, that's when everything started getting weird again. Something felt wrong, and it wasn't me being dumb. I don't know how to explain it. The road looked the same, my car was running fine, and the music on the playlist was one that I've listened to 1,000 times. But I felt like I was moving through a dream. I kept driving, zoning out as I went. I wasn't paying much attention to time or my surroundings, just trying to get lost in the road. When I checked the time, I almost swerved off the road. The clock on the dashboard showed I'd been driving for nearly an hour. But the thing was, I'd only left my apartment about 15 minutes ago. I glanced at my phone to double check. Same time. I slowed down, confused. I couldn't have been driving for an hour already. I wasn't even that far away from my house, and the playlist was still going. The time didn't switch back this time, though. I pulled over, waiting for it to happen, but for whatever reason, I lost that entire hour. My mind raced through possibilities, but nothing made sense. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't just tired. I wasn't sure if I'd traveled through time, maybe somehow gotten lost in my own neighborhood, or if the world had just decided to play some cruel trick on me. I didn't know which option terrified me more, though. When I finally made it back home, I was just glad to be home and safe, but I still couldn't make sense of what had just happened. I sat down and checked the clock on the wall again. I'd been gone for much longer than I thought, and that's when I noticed something else weird. My keys, which I could have sworn I'd left on the kitchen counter, were sitting on the table beside me. I hadn't touched them since I came in. I shook my head trying to focus. Was I losing my mind, or was something I couldn't see messing with me? Did I have a ghost? I don't know. As far as I know, though, ghosts don't make time glitch, do they? It felt like reality was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know what to do. By day 3, I had started to think maybe I just lost it. I woke up that morning feeling the same unease as I had for the past 2 days. I decided to go for a run, to get out of the house, to get some fresh air, and maybe that would help clear my mind and help me figure out what in the hell was going on. The run itself was nothing out of the ordinary. I jogged down the usual route past the houses that I knew well. I kept my pace steady, focusing on my breathing. I must have been too distracted, because the next thing I knew, I was standing at my front door, drenched in sweat, looking at the clock on the wall. What I'm about to tell you, I swear to you, I'm not exaggerating. 3 hours had passed. I could barely process what I was seeing. My run should have taken me less than an hour. I checked my phone, but the same thing was happening. 3 hours, just gone. How in the hell had I lost so much time? I didn't feel like I'd been running that long. I hadn't even stopped once, and I was sure I had just left the house a short while ago. And let's face it, nobody can run for 3 hours straight, especially me. But there I was, 3 hours later, with no rational explanation of what had just happened. I tried to reason with myself, maybe that I'd lost track of time or something, but no matter how hard I thought about it, nothing made sense. I kept replaying the moments before I'd left. There was nothing out of the ordinary happening, and yet somehow 3 hours had just vanished. I stood there for a moment, trying to hold myself together, but then I started thinking that maybe something happened that I couldn't remember. The more I thought about it, the less I was sure. The gap in time definitely didn't sit right with me. It was like I'd been staying somewhere else during those hours. My memories of the run didn't match up to the time that had passed. By the time I was actually able to settle down, I had the disturbing thought that I was the only one aware of these glitches. Something had changed that nobody else was aware of, and I didn't know how to get back. But after that day, luckily I didn't experience any more time glitches. But I still have no idea what happened to those missing hours. Small things did keep happening though. I'd find objects in places I know I hadn't left them, like the keys, or a book that I didn't remember reading. I knew it wasn't just forgetfulness. I had no answers, just more questions. I was desperate for answers at this point. The glitches were messing with my head in ways I couldn't even begin to explain. Each day that passed, I felt more and more like I was losing control of my own reality. I felt like I was being caught in something bigger than me, something unexplainable, and I was just waiting for the next terrifying experience to happen. I tried talking to friends, but I couldn't actually bring myself to say the words out loud. What would I even say? I mean, Miles of all people would think it was cool and try to get to the bottom of it. But what was I going to say to him? Hey, I think time is messing with me. Also, I saw a faceless person in a restaurant. Nobody would really take me seriously. Worse yet, what if they thought I needed help? What if they tried to check me into a hospital or something? How would I be able to keep control in a place so confined? After that, I started going down rabbit holes on the internet, looking up anything that might explain the odd events. I looked up stuff like a glitch in the Matrix, time travel, alien abductions, anything that would pop up on feeds when I typed in missing time. People on the internet had all kinds of crazy theories about these things. A glitch in the Matrix was the most popular theory, and something that I hadn't heard of until I started reading about it. It was the one that made the most sense to me too. The idea that reality itself could be malfunctioning, that time and space were just computer programs, that something glitched. Maybe I had crossed into a different version of reality, or maybe time had just messed up. But the more I read, the more the theory started to feel impossible. I mean, this was real life. There was no way something that massive was happening and nobody else knew about it, right? That would be a worldwide phenomenon. It would be all over the news. People didn't know how a glitch in the Matrix would even work. How could time loop? How could it stretch or skip like that? The internet had a lot of theories about what a glitch could actually be, but none of them helped me feel better about what I was experiencing. Then, there was the time travel theory. Maybe something or someone had messed with the timeline. Like those sci-fi stories where people change small things in the past and cause ripples that affect the future. You know, a butterfly effect. But why would anyone want to mess with me? I wasn't important enough to be involved in some kind of time experiment. But then I thought, maybe that was the point. I was insignificant, so if something happened to me, it wouldn't matter. The whole concept just seemed too far out there, even further than a time glitch or a glitch in the Matrix. Then came the alien abduction theory, the one that scared me the most, honestly. Some people said time glitches were a byproduct of alien interference. They said abductions could leave holes in your memory, or make it seem like time had been stretched or skipped. The more I read, the more I started to wonder. Could I have actually been abducted by aliens? Aliens weren't even something that I believed in, but here I was, reading about them, thinking that maybe I was an abductee. But there were no weird marks on my body like all these encounters come with. No memories of strange lights or anything that could point to an abduction. The idea still lingers in my mind sometimes, though. But, thinking hard on it, it had to be a glitch in the Matrix, right? That's the most reasonable explanation. But I guess any of these theories could actually explain what I saw. I even wonder if maybe I was just going crazy. Can I just go crazy for a couple of days and then clear up? But then what about the faceless guy? Was that part of the glitch, or was that an alien watching me and getting ready to strike? I swear to you, I am not crazy. Everything else in my life still makes perfect sense. I still have the same job, the same friends, and the same family. I still have the same memories, and nothing like that's changed. Another theory I read on the message boards was, what if I was living in some kind of parallel universe, or an alternate timeline? What if I had died in one version of reality and ended up in another, and I just couldn't remember the other one? Or what if I was stuck in a loop? I still don't know for sure what happened for those 3 days, but that was 2 years ago now. Any help would be nice. I'd like to understand what happened to me during those days.